Hello, I'm Ben Wilson, and it's really exciting to be here as part of the conference. I'm going to be giving a talk that I originally gave at an event a few years ago, pre-pandemic, called Dyspraxia in Game Design. And I hope you find it worthwhile or interesting or useful in some way. Let's get started. So, yeah, this is me. I'm Ben. Hello. I'm an indie developer turned game designer for AAA, now back to working in indie games again. Currently working at Die Gute Fabrik on their new project. And I've been working in the industry for around 6.5 years, and making games solo for about 3 years prior to that. I'm here to talk about my approach to making my solo games in particular, and finding inspiration in unusual places. In my case, my experience with dyspraxia. I'm actually going to take my webcam off here just so it doesn't block any other slides. And yeah, before we get into it, I really want to just quickly run through what this talk is, and more importantly, what it isn't. It's a personal account, first and foremost, of how I look at developing game ideas, filtered through the lens of a learning disability. It's also an encouragement to explore a wider spectrum of emotional content in games. This talk isn't going to be comprehensive or authoritative. I don't pretend to have anything figured out outside of what's worked well in my own experience. And it's also not an argument for empathy games or a guide for how to exploit and commodify trauma. That's not something I'm interested in, and we're not doing that here. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. So before I talk about games, I'm going to talk a little bit about this condition that I grew up with. It's called developmental coordination disorder, or dyspraxia. And it's in the same family of neurological conditions as dyslexia, which is probably more well known. And in fact, it's not uncommon for people who have one condition to also have the other. Broadly speaking, it's a chronic condition that affects your hand-eye coordination, your motor function, and to varying degrees your sense of direction, and your ability to organize thoughts. And this can manifest in the form of a bunch of different day-to-day symptoms. I'm not going to dive too deep into these here, but I have some of the common ones just showing up on the screen. And like a lot of conditions like this, it operates on a wide spectrum in terms of severity. In my case, it's totally manageable. Nowadays, it only really affects my everyday life in small ways. When I was growing up, though, doing regular domestic things like using a knife and fork at a table, or tying my shoelaces, or playing video games, these were often quite mentally exhausting things to do, in a way that none of my friends or family seemed to be able to relate to. Certain tasks would just leave me feeling really drained after doing them. And I could never articulate what I was experiencing at the time. And because I wasn't struggling with life per se in an outwardly visible way, over time I just sort of assumed that this was just one of those things that everybody just must have experienced. Typing is a pretty good example of a thing that I have problems with. I've always hated typing, and to this day I try and avoid it as much as possible. After practicing a bunch over the years, I've managed to reach an okay level of proficiency, but that draining feeling that I was talking about earlier has never really gone away. So this is what it feels like, as closely as I can describe it. I get a weird sort of uncomfortable sensation whenever I'm typing, or playing a game, or doing anything where the pace of it is moving too fast for me to process. I can feel my brain sort of straining at the limits of its mental bandwidth, and I get this sensation that feels like my brain is working at a speed that my body can't quite catch up to. It's this feeling of just sort of sluggishness and frustration that it's not exactly painful, but it is uncomfortable. This GIF is a pretty accurate visual description of what I look like when I'm at my desk. But anyway, when I got diagnosed for this condition in my 20s, it was the first time that it dawned on me that that feeling wasn't a normal thing that just everybody experienced. And for the next few years, I sort of got a little bit obsessed with thinking about like, oh, hey, what parts of my daily experience are not like other people's? And how can I even go about expressing this? Do I even have the vocabulary to talk about this? So fast forward a few years, and I've started making games. Game design has become a thing that is routinely on my mind, and it's the start of what would become a career in video games. So I'm making tiny, strange arcade games and figuring out my creative style, just figuring everything out as I go. Fast forward a few more years, and I'm thinking more and more about making games as an outlet for self-expression. And I found this to be a difficult step because as a creator, I'm not especially good at stories in a conventional way, or characters, or anything more than the loosest of loosest implied narratives. For instance, none of my solo games even have people in them. They're mostly tiny, abstract, arcade-style games where you get points for doing things. And so I'm thinking about self-expression, and it's around this time when I sort of make a little discovery as I was replaying Super Hexagon. And it occurred to me that I could make a game that was just super focused around eliciting a single feeling like Hexagon does. This is a game that creates a sense of flow by being so singular in its purpose that there's really no diversion or distraction of the player's attention. The game has 2 buttons, left and right, and there are no simulated elements that divide your attention even a little bit, like the concept of gravity or health or enemies. And after that I went back and replayed Bennett Foddy's GURP, which is a game I always liked. And I noticed this time that the way it smartly used its weird control scheme to mirror the actions happening in game, making the player kind of feel like they're embodying the character in a physical sense. If there's any of you who haven't played GURP, by the way, you should try and find it. It's a free web game, and it's a really good example of what I want to talk about here. I haven't checked in it, and I haven't checked it in a while, but I hope you can still play it somewhere. So I'm playing these games, among others, and at some point I put together the thought that, hey, I could make games that were focused around having the player grapple with the feelings I experience as part of dyspraxia. I couldn't give the player my condition, obviously, but I could maybe evoke the feeling of it by drawing some of its symptoms out and figuring out how to represent them through game systems. And I think there's a sense of playfulness in that idea. I think of it as the same sense of fun people get from breathing in helium so that they can talk with a high voice. It's that sense of stepping outside of your usual norms and feeling something new. So this sort of became my process. This is a sort of summarized form. It's not as neat as this in practice, but just for the sake of being brief, there are 3 steps. Identify an experience you want to portray, then describe that experience in terms of abstract feelings, and then design a gameplay metaphor that elicits those feelings. It's time for an example. I'm going to use GURP here as an example, and I have no reason to think that Bennett Foddy, the creator of GURP, had a process that looked anything remotely like mine. It just happens to work well as an example. So firstly, the experience we want to convey is the feeling of rock climbing. So we're making a game about rock climbing, and this is the game we make. For step 2, we pick out some key words that maybe describe the experience in abstract terms. So words I can think of relating to this is maybe reach, momentum, grip, proprioception. That's a fancy word for just body awareness. And then finally at step 3, we try and design a gameplay metaphor that incorporates those abstractions we just listed. So GURP, what I like about GURP is that it has this really solid gameplay metaphor for the experience it's trying to convey. The real-world experience of needing to concentrate on where each of your limbs should go is represented by making the player concentrate on where their fingers need to go. And that's combined with the need to use momentum to get reach, and the need to hold and release grip at the right time, both of which are mirroring real factors. And the result is that you have this set of gameplay systems that when you play it, it has a stronger emotional sensation of rock climbing compared to, say, climbing in an Assassin's Creed game. Next example here is a game I worked on called TV Trouble. It's a game where you play a TV repair person in 1967 and you're solving these micro puzzles to repair as many TVs as you can against the clock. I wanted to capture a sense of sort of tongue-in-cheek bleakness in the way that the job is depicted, and I used a similar process to the one I've just talked about. In the case of this game, I'm not drawing from a personal experience, I'm just using the same sort of process to create this implied narrative of this overworked, nameless worker who you're inhabiting. So yeah, now I'm going to go through some of my games that were inspired by my experiences with dyspraxia. Button Frenzy, my first example here, is a game about performing like what is really a extremely simple task, but at a rate that's incredibly difficult to comfortably keep track of. The explicit aim of this is to recreate the feeling I was describing of your brain moving at a speed that your body struggles to keep up with. The game operates at such a speed that in order to do well, the player has to stop thinking explicitly about the task at hand and trust their muscle memory instead. The most common feedback I got from taking the game to exhibitions was of players describing their uncomfortable loss of control over their fingers, and for many people it was their first time experiencing something that is just a part of my sort of everyday existence. The next game here is called Concentric. It's a minimalist action game about moving in circles. Or if you want a quick and dirty description, it's kind of like Frogger, but played on a circular world. For this game, I wanted to think about something that I still have issues with to this day, and that's being able to tell left from right, and being generally confused about the concept of directions. So in this game, that feeling of disorientation is one that I zoomed in on. And I made that feeling the primary source of friction in the game. The circular playfield deliberately forces the player to think about their relative left and right as they navigate hazards, and that's not something you really tend to do in video games, so it's sort of creating some friction there. The intended player feeling is a quiet sense of, oh, I know what I want to do here, but it'd be so much easier if I could just tell which side was which. Just that quiet sense, that feeling in the back of your head. That was the aim. Last example here is a game called Evader. It's basically a twin-stick shooter, but without any of the shooting. So you control these two pucks connected by a beam, and you have to move them independently. And the thing I wanted to capture here was the feeling I get whenever my attention is split between two things, and the effect that that has on my coordination. And so I made that into a metaphor by having you, A, control two things at once, and B, having the player do two things at once, two separate tasks at once. You're destroying enemies with the beam and also avoiding getting hit with by any of the enemies. So while I was writing this talk, it occurred to me that this process is kind of like the opposite of how people tend to interpret dreams. In that process, you decrypt like this coded metaphor and you infer meaning from it. And in my process, you're sort of doing the reverse of that and encoding these metaphors as gameplay and leaving them there for the player to experience. And this is I know this is a flimsy analogy, and I'm not even that big into dream interpretations really, but I still like it. We're going to close out, we're going to wrap up now with a few takeaways. The first one is to look outside of games for interesting game mechanics. Draw from outside of games for your inspiration. In my case, that's my experiences with dyspraxia, but experiences are everywhere. And so much of what we experience as people, so many of these small relatable experiences are still uncaptured by video games. The next takeaway is to make gameplay metaphors that describe an experience, to make that gameplay feel emotionally sort of consistent with that experience. And my last takeaway here is that your game can be autobiographical without having a story. If you're someone like me who thinks about games in terms of systems and gravitates towards that, you don't have to think about your games as devoid of meaning and personality. Games can still convey something to the people who play them, and you have a huge hand in authoring that. And that's the end of the presentation. Thanks for listening. You can find me on the internet in various places. If you have questions, here's my link tree. And thanks again for your time.